looks like I did not get information to people in time. All right. Well, at least we didn't lose power. That's something. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started, because this way, hopefully, I'm just doing it once. Okay. You're getting a nuke. It's the first time that you have gotten bees, maybe. Or maybe they died last winter. We're going to start at the beginning. If you've already been through this, some of this will be review. But we are going to just take it from the very beginning. Your nuke. I'm assuming you're getting a nuke because of the people I've talked to, most of them are getting nukes. And if you email me, I will say more about packages in a different video. So a nuke arrives with a queen, brood in all stages, nurse bees, and forager bees. What does that actually look like? Let's look at some pictures. Taken with my trusty iPhone 4. Oh, before we do that, let's review what you should have set up. A solid hive stand. You really don't want it. One cinder block high is a little low, but it can work. I would suggest putting something like a board or a plastic lid or something in front of the grass from growing up there. 18 inches is as high as I'd want to go, because you will be stacking boxes up. You really should have, even with my nukes, to put in that kill the mites, and so your hive will start with a clean slate. And they don't hurt the bees. If they're 4 strips, it doesn't hurt the bees, which is nice. There's not a concentration effect. So it's specifically Apivar strips that I'm recommending. I put in a pollen patty, just like a third of it, freeze the rest, and sugar syrup. I recommend 2 parts sugar to 1 part water. Different formulations. As long as it's coming frequently and in a plentiful way, the bees will be fine. Okay, and of course both boxes need to be assembled and painted. So she was probably thinking about laying eggs here. Here's another frame with a queen. She's a lot easier to find. She's got a lovely golden color, top of some capped brood, and that brings us to talking about what the queen makes, which is baby bees. You can just barely see in the cells here. They look like little rice grains. They're about the size of the tip of the bee legs, like their little toes, about that size. And this is like a caterpillar egg, really. This is analogous to a butterfly analogous to the caterpillar life stage. These are larvae, bee larvae that will be capped soon. This is the final stage. The bee larvae becomes capped. It spins its own chrysalis, and it's of 13 days. These numbers will be important soon. It's an egg for 3 days, larvae open brood for 5 days, capped for 13 days or so. Keepers who take notes are happy beekeepers. It's the subliminal message I'm trying to send to you. So, we're going to go back for a minute. Are the bees here nurse bees? Forager bees? Well, the nurse bees tend to stay on the combs. The forager bees tend to fly out. So for the most part, and forager bees are the ones who are flying out of the hive. But when you just look at a bee, period, you cannot see the difference between a nurse bee and a forager bee. You definitely want to see the bee a lot more covered with bees than these ones are. For the purposes of the pictures, I think I had shaken the bees off of these frames. You want to see them pretty well covered with bees. The point of inspecting your hive is to see if what you're expecting to be true is true. You're expecting a functional, happy hive. So you want to see if that's true. But when you're just starting with a nuke, it's not going to start as an adult hive. There's a growth period. So all you expect to see the queen or eggs. There might be enough bees that it's hard to find the queen. You should be able to find her on just 5 frames when she's marked. Sometimes you can't, but she's in there. You expect to see capped brood and 5 frames covered with bees. That's what 5 frames of bees mean. 2 of those frames are stores, and the other 3 are brood and space for the queen to lay, maybe a little bit of space. Now, 7 to 10 days later, you expect progress in drawing out the frames and in laying in them. But Oh, but you have to factor in the weather. If it's cold, and if you're not feeding, like right now, there's no nectar coming in, even on nice days. If you are not feeding with sugar syrup, the bees are not going to draw out comb when there's no nectar coming in. Even if there is nectar coming in, if there's a spate of rainy days and you're not feeding sugar syrup, they're not in progress of drawing out comb. Some of them drawing out comb is on you as the beekeeper. A quart a day or 4 quarts twice a week. That's what to aim for once the temperatures are milder. So there's your part, and then there's Mother Nature's part. If it's highs in the 40s or maybe 50s, the bees just cannot really draw out a lot of comb. They can't take sugar syrup well. And that's going to delay, assuming everything is good, progress should look like. The frames just outside of those nuke frames will get comb starting in the center. They'll fill it first, and that'll be like frames 3 and 9. Frames 4 through 8 are your nuke frames. And then the next layer of the outer frames will get started in a week later. That would be frames 2 and 8. And then frames 3 and 9, which had just gotten drawn out and filled with stores, will turn into brood frames. The queen always starts laying in the center of the frames and prefers the center of the hive. Let's see if there's any comments. Oh, do I need to set up comments somehow? Shoot, that was the whole point of doing this on YouTube instead of Zoom. Well, email me if you wanted to. So, hopefully it's recording this and I won't have to do it again. But then it'll be even more polished the next time. Okay, and the queen always starts laying in the center of the frames. She prefers the center of the hive or well drawn out frames, but sometimes she's desperate and will lay in comb that's only half drawn out. Bit of a leap of faith there. So let's see a schematic of this. Day 0, you install frames. The frames that are yellow are the frames that they're fully drawn out. This is what you got from the person selling the nuke. They have honey or nectar and pollen. And then the frame that's the lightest color, frame 7, has eggs and larvae on it. The frame that's the darkest color has cat brood. Cat brood is darker when it's closer to being emerging, when it's on the more mature side. And this lighter color is the cat brood that is recently capped. So that's the first day. Then, about a week later, it'll take the bees a while to recover, to get their foragers set up. But about a week later, at least one more frame should have brood. And at least the frames outside this cluster should be partially drawn out. It might have made more progress, but this is definitely the minimum I would expect, assuming the weather's good and you are, or milder than like highs in the 60s, and you are feeding sugar syrup like you mean it. They might take a quart a day. And then 2 weeks later, I would expect all of the frames that you were provided with now have brood in them. The bees used up the stores there to feed baby bees and left room for the queen, so she's going to lay in those frames first. And then the new frames are going to mainly have stores. So we're going to pause here. Oh, we're going to move on to day 21, which is 3 weeks later. And the queen should have brood now in a new frame. And the bees should have drawn the box out pretty well. We're going to talk more about transitioning from day 14 to day 21 in a bit. And this is definitely going to be time for another box. But I just got to emphasize weather. If it's highs are going to be below about 45, below 50, 45, especially if it's 50 and like rainy and chilly. You're just not going to draw out much comb. They have to heat up the beeswax that they exude from their little glands to like 90 plus degrees to be able to shape it with their little mandibles, and they just can't do it when it's cold, or at least not as quickly. They can draw out like 2 frames of comb in a week if it's good weather and they're being fed well. And the beekeeper, see my subliminal message up in the corner, not feeding like a pollen patty and enough sugar syrup, and there's poor weather, or even if you're not feeding, and they can take those nutrients at night, you know? They won't progress as fast. All right, lecture's over. So you are going to want to see the eggs and see the cat brood when you get your nuke frames and when you're installing them. I would really recommend writing from the nuke. Like permanent marker on the top of the frames is good. And then reviewing, you expect the frames next to the nuke to start to be drawn out by day 7 and day 14. Those eggs you saw before, those are now capped brood. New frames now should have eggs in them. Here's another way to look at it. Day 0, day 7, there's going to be new comb, but not much new brood outside. And then that new comb should have eggs by week 2. So this is something really important to understand. You're going to start with 5 frames covered with bees. By day 7, you might have 7 frames covered with bees. You might have 6 frames. By day 14, you will probably have all of them, or at least 8 of them, covered with bees. So it's not going to be a new frame. It's almost a frame of bees a week. In 5 weeks, that's 5 more frames of brood, or frames covered with bees. I mean, you've filled the whole box, and it's probably not even going to take 5 weeks. It's really going to take like 3 weeks to get to that point. Because 1 frame of cat brood becomes 2 frames covered with bees. You can see the bees are stacked horizontally when they are brood. They're about the same size in those cells that they will be when they emerge as adults. But when they're, I guess, vertical on the comb, they take up twice as much room. It takes 12 days to mature, and then all of the brood emerges. So you're going to gain 2 frames of bees in 2 days. Okay, when you're inspecting, one of the most important aspects of a successful inspection is when you know what you're seeing. You know what eggs look like. You know what larvae and cat brood look like. You know where to look for new comb and understand that that's new comb. And you understand that the hive, these things aren't randomly. And you also know what you should be seeing. So you have a sense from the date of install how much progression you're likely to see the next time you open up the hive, and that it's going to be affected by the weather. And knowing how long that frame of eggs is going to, until it becomes a frame covered with bees, having a sense of that is really important. So we're going to review that here in a minute, but entrance activity. I love watching entrance activity. When should you see this? The bees are kind of fussy about the weather. They don't dewy. I have seen them forage in the rain if it's mild, but if it's cool, it has to be pretty sunny for them to go out. And what will they be doing? Well, collecting pollen. And that looks like this. You can see right here, there's a bee with the pantaloons, the pollen basket full to the hive here. And here's another view. This is a different hive style where the entrance is just this hole, and here these bees are about to go in there carrying pollen. They might be collecting nectar. Some of these bees are about to go in. Oh, you got this one here who's returning. I think her abdomen's pretty plump here. She picked up water. There's no nectar this time of year. But sometime, at some point that's going to be nectar. Here is a bowl with here's a few bees getting water. Here is a bee getting water. And here is another container where the bees are a lot more serious about taking. So they really like something that's only a couple inches high, that has a lot of landing pads. They like to land where other bees are. It's like, oh, that must be, it can get a little comical. Easy flight in to area that has the water container, so it doesn't have tall grass around it, doesn't have a lot of obstacles around it. I mean, they're little airplanes, so they got to work with the aerodynamics of the situation. Okay, and this can tell you a lot about what's going on in the hive. A queen right hive, in the spring, they'll take in a lot of pollen. This is when the hive population is growing. You'll see a lot of foragers, like 15 in 10 seconds if the weather's good. When there is, or any brood, way fewer will have pollen, and there might be 10 foragers in 10 seconds, usually less. Why risk it? There's nothing goosing them along to forage. When there's only drone brood, they'll still bring in a lot of pollen. They'll still be foragers if the weather is good. Only drone brood happens when the workers themselves start laying unfertilized eggs, or when the queen either runs out of sperm or she never was properly mated. Then you get a hive that fills up with drone brood. But it can look like queen right traffic, so there's a lot of limits to what the entrance activity can tell you. I always note it. At this point, they get a check mark. Unless they're specific, I want to note. About how many come in 10 seconds and about the percent pollen. Revealed a failing queen? Not really. Has it revealed a hive that was getting ready to swarm? No. It has that swarmed when I didn't realize it because those hives had a lot lower traffic than they'd had the day before their bees, but that effect only lasts for like 2 days. So you have to be looking at their activity every day to spot that drop, and you really don't want to spot that drop. You want them to stay in the box. Has it revealed a hive with problems? Yes. When there's low numbers of bees. Usually this takes some time to develop. You can tell there's an issue when the traffic for that hive compared to the other hives is a lot lower. So, it's no replacement for actually opening up the hive. So now we're going to move on to inspection technique. Here, I'm going to get a little complicated and try to show with like me in the video some of these steps. So we'll see if it works. Step number 1, look at the entrance traffic, make some notes about it. Number 2, pull off the lid and the feeder box. 3, pry up the inner cover. So you don't there. This gets really hard to do as time passes and the bees bring in propolis and cement things. So sometimes it'll take as long as 30 seconds to get the inner cover off because I will get my hive tool in, kind of wiggle it in there, and then lever, and I'll just slowly push the inner cover away from the hive and just wait for the propolis to let go, popping it. So when it's really cold, this doesn't work, but usually we're not inspecting when it's really cold. So when it's warm, you just give it time. I note the clutch size on top. If it's a strong hive, it's going to get a check mark. When the hive is growing, you can actually count the number of frames that have bees on them by just from the top. Notice I haven't said anything about smoke. I usually don't smoke the hive when opening the lid. I do not have bees fly at me, and I don't need them to move out of the way. When I need them to move, smoke them, but I don't just do a preemptive smoking. Okay, now it's time to pull out the frames. And I do start the smoker before I pop the lid though. Okay, so a general tip, move like you're underwater, almost in slow motion. And I'm going to also mention here, I wear nitrile gloves. I've used black before. The bees interpret it as a bird pecking at their hive, so I don't recommend black. Blue is a good color. I would not recommend dark purple or red because to bee eyes it may look like black. Teal blue or light blue that's like one of their primary colors. Those are good colors. Good colors to choose from. I buy mine. Oh boy. And while I'm recording this video, good luck finding some online. If you cannot get those kind of gloves, you could try the really rubbery gardening gloves. But you don't want fuzziness on the heavy-duty ones. You want almost like dishwasher gloves, but really tight-fitting. I really don't recommend the so-called beekeeping gloves because it's so hard to manipulate things. Okay, and move like you're underwater. And avoid crushing a rolling bees is not just good karma, it also minimizes the amount of defensive pheromone that's being released. And the bees are they're like rubberneckers. Accident. As soon as you crush a bee, you get a whole bunch clustering around there. And usually you crush the bee where you need to be moving things around. So it just gets challenging. This is where you definitely need to use a smoker. Or just try to avoid crushing or rolling bees. When you move frames around, it's the most dangerous time for the poor little critters. And then if I need to pry apart 2 frames so that I can eventually get frame free to lift it up, I will use gentle smoke to try and get them out of the way. As the hive gets crowded, this doesn't work nowhere to go because it's covered with bees, but it's something that does get them out of the way for a little while. And then you never start in the center. You start either just outside the cluster. If you've got 6 frames covered with bees, start at frame number 7. Or the outermost frame, bees are covered. All of the frames have bees on them. It's the frame least likely to have the queen. And I frame in the feeder box or so-called quiet box if I'm done using a empty deep as the feeder box quart jars. You can take a relatively empty frame without much nectar and just put it by the entrance. Don't put it flat somewhere. You're going to step on it. Here's an example of an inspection sheet. Oh wait, you know what? Now we'll try. Oh, I don't know how to go from screen to video. Huh. That's the one thing I didn't practice. Oh, I should have taken a video and then shown it. Let me think here. So, I can turn on my webcam. Hold on, camera. And then you'll see my camera while I'm live streaming. Okay. Problem solving at its finest. Oh, that light, that's right. Pardon me while I get our classroom ready. Okay, is that better? That's better. Okay, now we have to name things down. Okay, you can see. Hi, I'm going to show some of my tools here. So before you pop the inner cover off, before you pop the lid off, get your smoker going. So we'll pretend it's going. This is a hive tool. This is a frame gripper, and I really like it for pulling frame, but I don't use it on the rest of the frames. It's just too easy to drop a frame, and this will, if you're prone to heart attacks, give you one. And then I use a board as a half roof while I have the open. All right, so we'll get back to those in a minute. Oh, okay, so then first step in the inspection, the hive entrance is here. Do not stand in front of the hive entrance while you're inspecting. You can stand to this side or to the rear of the hive. Okay. Okay, so we'll pretend this is still flat, but now you can kind of see. Hopefully nothing will fall down with the clatter. Okay, so I have my inner cover. So then we'll pretend that this is vertical with gravity, and I'm just gonna take the hive tool and really I'm trying to chisel between the inner covers there. And you will have to use a lot of force. And then I'm just gonna wedge it in as best I can while gravity works against me. And then I slowly pry it off. Oh, and I forgot to mention, I like to put this by the entrance, like just tilt it up, and the bees will crawl in, but I don't block the entrance. Okay. So then for the first frame, sometimes you'll have to the first frame to take out, we'll pretend the cluster actually is on the center, like 8 frames, so it's not on the last frame at all. So then it's really easy to just take out this last frame. And then this is a shallow frame because I didn't bring it deep in because it was cold outside. I just set that by the entrance. And then to take out the next frame, pretend my hand isn't holding it from falling, I get my hive tool between the 2 frames, between the ears, and then I push it apart, and then I'll push it apart at the other side. And then when I'm lifting, I'm making sure that it stays horizontal and it doesn't rub up against the side, and I'm not letting any piece of the frame touch the box. So you can kind of feel that. And I pull it out really slowly. Now I'm going to look at it, and I'm looking, these outer frames I would expect to find pollen and honey, and then I'll push this frame to the outermost position, and I'll look at the next frame. So sometimes I'll pry them apart by just sticking this in as a wedge, and it's kind of sides, and then I'll pull that out and look at it. At this point in the inspection, I would expect to see brood. Okay, so then I've seen what I need to. When I put the frames back, I try to have these ears rub on each other so that they're touching as I push the frame in, and that way I'm not going to crush any bees. And then when I use the end parts here down, I try to make sure there's no bees under there, which is not easy when the hive gets crowded, but it's a lot easier early on. And so you can move the frames like this when you slide them, and when you slide them you have to watch you don't crush them between the ears. And sometimes I just kind of gently I just gently encourage the bees to move, and then sometimes I actually have to put it down between the ears, close it on my hive tool, pull it out to get the bees to leave that area alone. Oh, and this is what I would do with my half roof. I would put it on, oh, that's working. I would put it on the half of the hive that I'm not inspecting. And then you put everything back together, put the final frame in, put on. I try not to squish any bees. Sometimes I have to put the inner cover back on. Oh, I didn't move like I was underwater, did I? More like how I would really move. Pick up the inner cover. The notch goes towards the entrance. This probably has bees on it. And then gently put the inner cover down. Sometimes I'll just wait for that side to be clear of bees, and then I just kind of tap, 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 and they'll eventually move. And then if there are bees on here, sometimes I'll just be lazy and just tap like that and they fall off, or I'll flick them off and then get them inside. And for my inner cover, I used a hole saw to make feeder mason jar holes. So I just set the mason jar on top. If you ever have any of these open for bees to go in the feeder box, and I love it. Recommend everyone do that. All right. Back to the slideshow. That was enough of me being Vanna White. Okay. Done with camera. Back to inspections. So the idea here is this is an inspection. The inspection sheet is your auxiliary memory. But it's also during the inspection of what you should be looking at. So which hive is this? What day is it? Any notes about the weather? What was the into the hive? How many had pollen? Are they taking water? If they are, it means they're coming in, usually. Are there drones flying? A reminder to check how many frames are covered on top of the hive. What's the capped worker brood pattern? Are they defensive? Sometimes they'll do headbutts against your veil. Sometimes they'll follow you when you walk away, and then sometimes they'll sting. And then a reminder of what to look at on the outer frames. Is there actually nectar there? This is not aimed at your growing hive. This is an inspection sheet. If you're feeding, you darn well better have stores in those outer frames. The upper part of the brood frame should have stores too. in I frame I saw the cap worker brood. It's a nice reminder on what side of the hive I started. And then notes about what you did. And then I act literally as though this is a frame. So if there was honey here, I'd write an H. If there was cap worker brood here, I would write CWB. And there's after her egg was laid. Usually it's longer, but a good weather, strong hive, it could be that short. And for worker bees, they really don't start foraging for over a month after they're laid. Oh, I could actually be in slide view. There we go. Okay, I would also mark a plus, like if there were a few bees on these frames, plus. Lots of bees, plus, plus, and like a big circle. And this, to read the hive, to write this stuff down. It helped me see patterns. But if that's too much, you definitely have some minimum things you need to write down. So let's say the date, May 1st, when you installed, when your nuke was installed. How many frames are covered with bees? It should be 5. Frames are drawn. Definitely going to be 5. And then making a note of the eggs that and cap brood that you should have seen. And what did you do? You installed the nuke. What do you do next? Check in 7 days for progress and more eggs. So then day 7, this would be like May 8th or so. You should say maybe a little bit more frames covered with bees, but maybe not that many more. And then you should see more progress with frames being drawn out. So you get the idea here. What did you do? Continued, So if you do something like moved frames around, you should mention that. First month inspections. Okay, first inspections. This is not your first visit to the hive, right? Because if you're feeding a quart a day or 4 quarts per half week, you've been there hopefully before you get to day 7. Day 7 is a good day to inspect. And what do you expect when you inspect? This is what your hive looked like. Then in 7 days, good weather, continue. They should at least have drawn out partially the outer frames here. There should be, so now here, notice that you've got 3 frames with pointing with my finger, that's not going to work. Then here you've got at least 1 more frame with eggs. This frame was eggs and is now early cap brood. And this frame was early cap brood and now is about to emerge in a week. And this is a frame that the bees have already emerged, leaving an opening for the queen to fill with eggs, and she did. Okay, so day 14, then we once again have the progression. These middle and brown frames had eggs 7 days ago, and now they are early cap brood. And notice how we now have 5 frames with brood. And this is by day 14. And this is like a slow progression. It could go faster if everything is optimal with the weather and with them being fed. And then now they actually have like the frames just outside your original 5 are not fully drawn out, but they're almost there. And more progress has been made. Okay. How many frames are covered with bees? You start with 5 frames covered with bees. By day 7, you expect just a little bit past where they had their original 5, probably not covering super well the new frames that they're drawing out. By day 14, 7 frames are well covered with bees. Because if they don't cover the frame well with bees, draw out comb. Now, day 14 is a good time to shuffle these outer frames. You take the outermost frame that's partially drawn, put it in the middle of the brood nest, leave a couple of frames of brood next to each other. And then same thing here where actually you're just reversing. You don't want to make huge open spaces, but you want to introduce some partially drawn comb and eventually get to the point where you have honey frame, drawn comb that has honey on the very outside of the hive. One more inspection before you can change that in this hive. So then day 21, you are needing to add that second brood box. So day 21, you shuffled things around. The bees drew out those frames really, really well. You can barely even tell that you put new frames in there, but there are eggs in those frames. And then be 9 frames solidly covered with bees by day 21, if not earlier. And you'll see at day 14, if you've made more progress on this, the second box on here. Okay, so here's another way to look at it. Day 0, the nuke already has eggs. Then, by day 7, those are her eggs. So, if you see eggs on day 7, the queen's okay. If you don't see eggs, this could be a problem, or it could mean that you don't know what you're looking for. The nuke frames came with eggs, and those are starting to become cat brood. Or you might see a queen cell here they're in the nuke you were delivered. That happens sometimes. Day 7 is when you would see a queen cell. Just let them go if they have 5 frames covered with bees. And day 14, those are still her eggs. She's laid a fresh batch, but it's going to be her cat brood at this point. Her eggs have become cat. You can look at the pattern here. It should be a good solid pattern. And oh, I didn't realize it would do that. Then by day 21, not only all her eggs and her cat brood from when you installed her, it's also her bees from when you installed her, because it's possible to make up a nuke by introducing a queen from somewhere else and then taking frames from a different hive and then just putting them together and selling a person a nuke. And that's actually from the south, that's part of how it's made. Sometimes they'll take a queen cell that was grafted from another queen, put 4-frame nuke, and they may not wait very long for that queen to lay her own eggs. Or they swap queen. Usually it's the queen's own eggs, but that's to be sure you want to see the queen's laying her own eggs by day 7. If you see a queen cell in the first 4 weeks, this can happen. If there's maybe 3 total, like no more than 1, maybe 2 if there's 3 total on 1 frame, it's a queen supersedure attempt by the bees, and they will typically not give up. They have something they're sensing about that queen that is subpar, and you're not going to change it by cutting out the queen cells. Just let them go. If you have fewer than 5 frames of bees, actually, you don't want to do this, because you're going to end up with a queen that's just going to get superseded again. You would want to buy a queen. Okay, if you have more like 3 to 4 on a frame and it's more than 1 frames, these are swarmy gits. These bees want to, even though they're supposed to be drawing out comb. If that queen cell is uncapped, they've just started it. There's white goo in the bottom, but it's not very long. It's not as long as your thumb. And there's eggs. Just cut them all out and interrupt the brood nest. I'll show you how to do that in the next slide. If it's capped, the queen cell is capped, and there's no eggs, it's very likely they already. You only want to leave 2 queen cells and cut the rest. If you're just not sure, it's hard to tell if there's a lot of bees in there, interrupt the brood nest. You can sometimes make the bees feel like they sort of swarmed, even though the queen is in there, by really messing with their sense of how. And here's how you do that. So you have 9 frames almost drawn out. You've got brood on 5 of them. You've got queen cells. Oh, okay. So then you're going to put your second box on. Oh, there should be 9 total. Okay, well, I'll fix that later. Oh, I can fix it now. And I must have missed another honey frame. There we go. Okay. So move 2 frames of brood up and give them a frame of honey right next to this frames of brood. And then have a frame of brood honey and then 2 frames of brood, and have all this be next to each other. Then put it back together and see if you can't tell for sure whether or not they swarmed. Oops. Then this is a strategy to try and really shake things out of work. It's very hard to manage bees that want to swarm no matter what. You might be better off just getting a new queen, but requeening is not easy. They'll probably. You'll want to stay ahead of them with giving them space. It's really hard to give them enough space if you don't have drawn out comb, because bees don't really interpret comb, like a brand new frame, as space. And for a hive that had queen cells, I would actually say once they get to the point of having about 2/3 of the bottom and the top box drawn out, I would put the super for honey in between while feeding them, just to get that comb drawn out. Okay. In the summer, the main dangers are summer dearth. Oh, I never finished summer dearth. Well, I'll talk about it in a minute. So for swarming, you have to add space before they're out of space. You have to remember that if you have 10 frames of bees and there's 3 frames of capped brood, pretty soon you're going to have 16 frames of bees.